Let's use the Visual Studio Debugger to step through our C# code. So we use the Input Exceptions project to demonstrate the use of the debugger in Visual Studio. So what we've been doing up until this time for console applications is we've been pressing Control F5 to run the application. And the nice thing about that is it causes the console window to stick, and you see this press any key to continue. However, what we might like to do is use the debugger to examine the execution of the program. If we say F5, it runs it through the debugger. But the problem, of course, is the window disappears and we don't get to see the output. So what we're going to do is we're going to stop execution partway through. There's a couple of ways you can do this. The simplest and the easiest way is over on the left-hand side of the code window, you see a gray bar. If you click on that bar on any line of code, you create what's called a breakpoint. And you can recognize the breakpoint by the red circle that is created in that gray bar, which means that execution will stop at that point should you run this code through the debugger. So we can do that, F5. And here you see the instruction pointer. So the breakpoint is the red circle and the yellow arrow is the instruction pointer. And if I'd like to go to the next line, a couple of ways I could do that. If you go to Debug, Step Into, you can go to the next line of execution, and the hotkey for that is F11. So F11, and you can see the instruction pointer goes to the next line, and the breakpoint stays where it is. So that yellow arrow points to the next line of code to be executed. So in other words, this line of code, the line of code in yellow, is yet to be executed. So F11 will go to the next line, which in this case goes to another method. So we've jumped from main into toColor might throw arbitrary enumeral. And F11 will go to the next line. Now, if we've decided we've executed enough of this particular method, instead of choosing F11, which is step into, we might choose step out, when the hotkey for that is Shift F11. And that means whatever method you're currently in, run it to completion, and then go back to where that was called from. So Shift F11 takes me back to main, the place that called the toColor method. So now I'll step. Now in this case, I could hit F11, which would step into the toColor might throw predefined exception method. Or I can say, I want to stay in this region of scope because I know what's going to happen in the method. So I'm going to step over that. So debug, step over. And as you can see, step over is F10. So F10. What happens is it executes the entire method but leaves us looking at the same region of scope, which in this case is main. So step into, step over, and step out of are the three basic ways to walk through the execution of the program. A couple of other things you might want to be able to do is only execute a breakpoint on a particular situation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop execution, and I'm going to add an additional breakpoint, let's say right here on line 31. I'm going to right-click on that breakpoint, and I'm going to go to Conditions. And my condition will be that when some conditional expression is true, and my conditional expression is going to be hue name being equal to DER, which of course it is. You can see the line above on line 30 that is exactly what hue name is equal to. And I'm going to set a set of actions, and that action will be to write to the output window the value of hue name. As you can see, the syntax for writing that message to the output window is very similar to what you see as a format string for console.writeLine or debug.writeLine. And notice I have the option of continuing execution or not. So I'm going to leave that checked for now. And as we go back and look at the breakpoint itself, just here, we can notice a couple of things about it. The first is that it is diamond-shaped, which means the execution will continue. And the second is that there's a white plus in the middle of that red diamond. And what that means is that there are conditions on this breakpoint. In other words, it doesn't always execute. So I'm going to close this and hit F5, which brings us to our first breakpoint, which is unconditional. As you see, it's circular. And then I'm going to say F11 to step through the code. Now, I don't want to see the execution of this method, and I could step over it, but in fact, I don't want to see the execution of any of these methods up until right before I get to my conditional breakpoint. So what I can do is I can drag the yellow arrow down to just before I want to execute. And now it executes all of those as one step. So you can actually drag the instruction pointer through your code to execute those lines of code without stepping through them. All right, so now I am at the line just before my breakpoint, and I want to take a look at the output window. And as you can see, the output window is down here, like so. If for whatever reason that window is not visible, you can also go to Debug Windows Output and bring that window up. And so let's look at the content of it. So right now it's writing out information about running the code. And now I do F11 to step to the next line. And at that point, even without executing the line of code itself, the breakpoint is hit, the condition is checked, and as you can see, because it matched the condition, it executed the action, which in this case was writing out the value of HuName to the output window. Now, let's say that you have a number of breakpoints in your code and you'd like to examine those. You can go to Debug, Windows, Breakpoints, and you will see a list of all of the breakpoints that you have in your code, along with the associated symbols and little information about them. You'll note that you can check or uncheck the box here, and what that causes to happen is a breakpoint becomes disabled. In other words, it doesn't delete the breakpoint, but it's no longer active, so it doesn't have any effect. And you can do that with both conditional and unconditional breakpoints. You can do the same thing by right-clicking on the breakpoint itself and selecting delete, or in this case, disable. So disable means that it's still there and you can see it, but it doesn't have any action, conditional or otherwise. Now, as you're stepping through your code, you might like to see values of various variables. So for example, you can select one and right-click on it and select Quick Watch, and that will tell you the value of that variable at that current time during execution. And if you like that to be a more permanent thing, you can right-click on a variable and select Add Watch, and that puts it in what's known as the watch window down here. And so as you can see, the value of that variable is placed in that window. And that's an introduction to the debugger in Visual Studio.